talk about regional cooperation and integration in Asia. Dr. Thirawut Sithinit is going to be the chair for this session, and there are three speakers. The first one is Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja, the Director of Research, ADBI. The second one is Dr. Peter Morgan, Senior Consultant for Research at ADBI. The last one is Dr. Matthias Kelvin, the Research Fellow at ADBI. And then we're going to have three discussants from Thammasat University, Dr. Pisut Kunhanawit, Dr. Sisha Thapimpan, and then Dr. Thirawut Sithinit himself. Okay, so let's start with the first paper by Dr. Ganeshan. Well, actually, let the chair say something and then set the rule for the second session.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to use the same rules as in previous sections, 12 minutes presenting and 5 minutes comments. And I'm going to give you a 2 minutes warning before the end, and at the end of the time, I keep you awake. Time is up. And then open the floor for discussion, 5 minutes. So please welcome and then listen to Professor Ganeshan Wignaraja for the first paper. So you have 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. So this study is actually available on the ADBI website, and you can download it from the publication bit, and it's free. So please, and we will send you some copies. So basically, the rise of Asia is really the big distinctive feature of the 21st century, and it's a historic transformation that involves the leading players on the planet, right? ASEAN, China, and India. So this study is all about three very simple things. It's about what does it mean for them, this rise? What does it mean for the rest of the countries that are not there? And how might we achieve a harmonious and peaceful rise of Asia as a whole and then the world? So the study is really about the future, but looking at the past and thinking about the scenarios under which the peaceful rise may occur. This is a sort of a flagship study done by ADB and ADBI, and there were many papers, background papers, that were put together into a major document, and there were different people that were involved. And the overall chairmanship of the set of people was Professor Masahiro Kawai, the former dean of ADBI, and Rajat Nag, the former managing director of the ADB, were the chair people, and then Peter Petri was the lead consultant. And there was a task manager called Viswajit Bhattacharya, and my role in this, just that we're clear, is I inherited this study to sort of finalize this at the end. And there were lots of eminent people. So really, the context of this is really simple, isn't it? That the world economy is shifting more to Asia, and we're trying to understand how the different shocks and changes may occur. We're trying to map trends so we can make policy. And this group of countries were picked not because they form a grouping per se, but that they are the key players, right? And so on. And you can read that at your leisure. Now, the study really tried to look at the prospects for growth, some of the determinants of this, and then it thought about policy to achieve that concept of harmony. So there was a very clear focus that we want to have a harmonious, peaceful rise of Asia, rather than the sudden, conflicting, difficult set of issues. So that we are all better off, and it took a sort of a medium-term time frame so we could understand the big changes. Now, there were some other studies associated with this, and there were some assumptions. I'm going to skip all that. Let me just briefly talk about methodology. So there were different tools that underlay the work here. First tool was a Cobb-Douglas production function that tried to estimate what would happen under certain assumptions to growth. And it had the standard things, and the residual was brought in as TFP and so on. And there are some numbers I'm going to show you what Asia might look like and the world might look like with the share of Asia in 2030. And I'm going to show you some numbers in purchasing power parity terms and also in nominal terms based on the assumptions of this particular exercise. The other thing that this study had was a CGE model that said, given those growth rates and patterns of labor input and output, a bit like what Patrick was saying, we're going to try to see what might be happening at the sectoral level and some of the other things that are there. And and there were various assumptions, and Fanzai, one of those people I mentioned, did the CG work here, and the firm heterogeneity that he brought into the model brought in this kind of Melitz stuff. I don't know if any of you all have done that. He's a new trade theorist who's quite famous, and that brings in different innovations. You get big numbers, basically, if you bring in this kind of way of doing it. And they projected stuff to 2030, and what it also did was they had a set of background papers by experts on sectors, like on water or energy and so on, who really gave their crystal ball view of what was going on in the sector in these different countries, and what changes they saw would occur, and what is it that one had to do in terms of policy to have reasonably symbiotic relations in that sector, and to deal with the changes that occurred. Here is a sense of what this thing tried to do. So the way the thing is structured, you have basically the modeling stuff here, and then you have some sectoral things, and then there was a set of conclusions. Okay? So this was a very comprehensive set of things. There were 24 background papers, and I think Peter wrote a background paper on finance, or you wrote the chapter on finance, right, Peter? Most of the chapter, okay. I did something on technology and so on, but there were also water people and all sorts of other characters. So it was internal and external people within ADB and ADB. Okay, let me now jump to some of the findings that you might want to work. So the first big thing was that, most of the world's poor still live in Asia, and one of the things the study sees is this big change in terms of the people who are really poor. 600 million people today, becoming on less than $1.25 a day. That number falls to 30 million by 2030, right? Based on the assumptions of growth and things this study makes. So that's a big change that's envisaged by 2030 under the baseline scenario in this study. And I'll talk a bit about the other scenarios. And then the other thing this study came out with in terms of big picture numbers was something like 2 billion people will join the middle class. And a lot of them come from the People's Republic of China, right? With an income, and by middle class we're talking about $10 to $100. So it's a very elastic concept of the middle class. Now that people are not poor, but not necessarily rich either. Okay? But it's people who are well off. And that structural change, the way the study envisages this, may enable these Asian countries, ASEAN, China, and India, to escape this so-called middle-income trap. So that's under a favorable set of circumstances. Okay? And that's a big, big change. Think about it, right? That's a big set of numbers. And that naturally drives huge changes. Asia then becomes, the world's leading consumers, right? And one hopes Thailand is, and all of you all are part of that game. The world's largest producers were in this region too, with the production network. Savers, investors by 2030. Okay? And then it presents these numbers based on that scenario. The PRC's income in purchasing power parity terms will become $26,000. India will become 11. So there's a gap, right? That gap that exists now still stays because People's Republic of China is still growing fast, and India, is trying to catch up. We hope, from the 3-4% to a slightly bigger number, the way this thing is done. And the shares of GDP become big. And I'm going to show you some numbers. The share of Asia's investment rises, consumption also rises, and by this huge group of consumers, other things happen. Demand for water and energy surges. So I'm trying to show you some big picture numbers. The primary energy demand of this region being so rich, all these people want white goods. The industries in this region want electricity. Huge surge in energy, right? And so we expect a doubling of that. ACI's dependence on water and gas will rise hugely, and so on. So big issues for the climate change dimension of this. Here are some numbers, and this is in constant prices. So the ACI countries, and there is ASEAN 3% today, PRC 10%, India 3%, and this is of the world GDP today, as it were. 16% is that region. Europe is 26%, United States is 23%. Thailand, I think, is in the report. If you really want it, I'll dig it out. Those go to 28%. Okay, so in constant prices, it goes to 28%, and there's the shares. ASEAN is 4%, it goes up a little bit. And the big gain is China and something for India. So that's how this looks. The interesting thing is what you know with China going to overtake the US in terms of world GDP, according to projections, by I think 2016 is some numbers I've seen. Some people say 2018. So depending on who talks about this, quite soon. Some people say 2020. So it just depends on what assumptions you make about the growth rate of China, which is beginning to decelerate this year. United States will have 18%, down from 23. Europe will go from 26 to 19. So big changes that may occur in the structure of the world economy. In constant prices, a different set of numbers that you get. Basically bigger numbers. ACI becomes 40%, China's share is bigger, India is bigger, and so on. ASEAN is also a bit bigger. But ASEAN, you see, notice with the two scenarios, ASEAN hasn't changed hugely, right? The big changes are in China and India. That has huge implications for you if you think about it. Okay, CO2 emissions, of course, the downside. There are all these bads apart from the goods that may occur. And now, this was the optimistic scenario. There are also several scenarios about bad things that can happen, from political conflict to food and other things. And then growth rates are basically lower and the numbers are lower. So I won't go into that. And here's some idea of some of the shocks that may be there, and you can look at this at your leisure. Okay. Now, to support all of this, the financial sector changes massively. And you can see some of the big challenges there. And the other aspect of this was not just that Asia rises in world GDP, but there needs to be a greater voice for Asia in world economic governance. In the IMF, the voting shares are very much tilted towards certain countries, and Asia should have a bigger voice. And we've had the implication of that, which is the setting up of this ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank by the People's Republic of China, which seems to think that it needs to drive its own institution in order to get changes in world governance. Okay, let me just rise to the last bit in the few minutes I have left. There are some common challenges from this big rise, and you can look at this at your leisure, big changes that must occur. And there are specific challenges for the individual bits of this, ASEAN, China, India. And for China, for instance, it's very much climate change and resource issues. For India, it's about inequality, which is the #1 issue. And just a few weeks ago, the Indian government had this big scheme where they set up 16 million bank accounts for the rural poor as a way of providing cash transfers to them and other ways to boost their things. So a hugely ambitious IT project with a banking project. I don't think ever done in the world history before, such big numbers, right? And there are going to be leakages we learned from this big scheme. So inequality is the big one. For ASEAN, it's all about competitiveness. Can ASEAN business maintain price quality of delivery that you did before, and can you survive this opening up to the AC process that Natpong talked about, but also other shocks that are going to come. And for Thailand, it's can you keep the production network in the auto sector in several risks, such as declining Japanese investment. There are other places Japan is looking at, notably India. Can you keep your labor productivity at excellent levels we knew before? Can you improve your logistics that are even better than before? And so on and so forth. So there's lots and lots of interesting issues you've got to worry about. And can your human capital, including this university, really upgrade even more? So can you increase your excellence even beyond where you are today? And this is the big challenge you don't have to worry about. Okay, let me briefly give you the recommendations. So we have to achieve this picture, we've got to do lots of things. This is not preordained. We've got to boost productivity, we have to improve human capital, we've got to deal with the climate issues, and so on. So lots of very detailed stuff. This is a 400-page report, Peter, am I right? Something like that. So a big study you can look at your leisure. Thank you. And we have to deal with the financial sector. We have to try to maintain this AEC to RCEP. And we have to talk about a much better voice for Asia, and so on. So this is very important. And there are specific recommendations for each grouping, which you can look at your leisure. And the last point, just to take 10 seconds if I may, is it also talked about changes in institutions at the regional level. It talked about the RCEP and what has to occur. And the two simple points is RCEP should have the boilerplate of the best things in all the ASEAN +1 agreements. And RCEP should also emphasize, special and differential treatment for the poor countries. And then he talked about more ambitious things longer ahead, such as an Asian Monetary Fund, which is an important aspect talked about before. A lot of empowering of ASEAN Secretariat. It raised skepticism about whether governments will give up sovereignty in order to do this, but clearly you need the technical needs. And I think the EU has some huge number of staff compared to the ASEAN Secretariat. ASEAN Secretariat some 80 professionals or something like that, some 80 to 100. EU has like 20 times that at least, right? Maybe even 50 times that. So lots of stuff in here and lots of food for thought, and please look at it in your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shan. I know that the time is our limitations. We hope we can listen to longer versions in the future. Can we have Professor Isut Gultanawit for discuss for this paper? I'll give you the same rules, okay, 5 minutes, and I'll give you 2 minutes warning as well.
Okay, thank you. So as we all know, it's quite difficult for me because the research already published the book. So I will try my best to do. So let's start with my first comment because you said per capita GDP income rise about this number. So I look into the data, the World Bank data here. So from 2013, so the real the GDP per capita in GDP is going to be 11,000 something. Once I calculate that I'm going to change from here to 2030, it seems that these two countries, China and India, is going to jump over 200%. That's interesting. But one more interesting is about Asia. Excluding Myanmar, increase about 50%, cast down on number. So the Asian number is too low. So what is the assumption behind the CGE model? So because we just believe that after we have the ASEAN, we think we're going to have all like this. Okay, that's my first comment. And also look into the data. So this from the World Development Indicators. It does, if these two countries are Brunei and Singapore. So what if we exclude these two countries? It does going to make more sense if we just concentrate on just only 8 members in ASEAN. Okay, because these kind of two outliers, they're gonna, because they are already 70,000, more than that you expect to increase in 2030. So that's the first one. And the second one is about production function. You said you took the standard production function from the class, which is the labor and capital. But I think if we put human capital like education, so will the result change a lot? Because human capital in terms of quality and quantity so are quite different across AIC or even ASEAN. So again, I took the number from World Development Indicators. So let's look at these two bottom lines from Laos and Myanmar. The school enrollment in secondary. So 10 years ago, it's about 30%, 35. It's moved just almost 50. And for the Singapore, I think, maybe from China, 60 to 90. But the gap still kind of wider. So if we include this, what's going to happen if we put the human capital in the model? And also the Philippines is much higher than the other countries. Malaysia and also for Indonesia and Thailand. Okay, that the second one and my third comment. So specific challenge. So this is just my point of view because I think the primary challenges from that picture, I think it should be developing human capital. It's going to provide the goal for the ASEANs. So because there's in the growth literature, so they said we might not see the convergence in growth, but we might see convergence in human capital instead. So this would be maybe, in my point of view, going to be primary challenge for ASEAN. So the fourth one, so you mentioned that national, regional perceived priorities. So I look at just only my specialized, my specialized which finance and macro. You said the ASEAN need to create integrated regional financial markets. So yes, we do have the roadmap for integration. We try to have the banking integration by 2020. That just the seminar that ADBI just arranged at the beginning of this month. In October. My question is possible because right now we know that even though we have the MIM Chiang Mai initiative on multi-regionalization, so 24 in 2010, but it took about 4 years to happen actually, and also in the capital market in Laos. So you know that the capital market in Laos just start October 10 and 2010. So it's quite far from integration. So my last comment is about, so you said 6 key emerging international institutions. I would like to need this one, as we know that the BRICS agree to have this new development bank that might play a key role to support infrastructure building in this region. Okay, so that will be all for my comments.
All right, thank you very much. So I think that like the most difficult roles of the chair is controlling the time. So I delegate this job to my students. Okay, so you're gonna give you a warning, 2 minutes warning. I'm gonna give the end of the round ring for all of you. Okay, so I think we have about 5 minutes for the question. We're gonna take some questions and we're gonna let okay, so sorry, Professor get a chance to answer after that. Anyone have some questions?
We have to introduce myself. Yes, please. My name is Kadri Jantalapurika. I'm the lecturer at Thammasat University here. Okay, concerning on Dr. Pisut and your last slide about the emerging regional institution, I would like to hear your opinions on Asian infrastructures, AIIB, the infrastructure banks that initiated by China. And what do you think about these competitors for ADBs? And so I would like to hear from you about the comments on this.
Next,
thank you very much for your presentation. It's very comprehensive. And I have a question to ask. Is that looking at the EU history of education, one thing that is linked to that is the education of the fiscal policy arrangement among EU countries as well. In your opinion, is there any prospect that eventually for the ACI or ASEAN country that will go to that direction at the end?
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, I'm a master's student here at Thammasat. My question is mostly to do with the AIIB as well, and this mostly comes from an institutional side because institutional economics has been discussed a lot lately, and I was wondering what you think about how the AIIB will influence the development of institutions in these developing countries, because as of now the IMF and the ADB, they have a strong focus on returns and governance and institutional development to go along with the infrastructure lending. Whereas I am guessing that the AIIB will not be following the Paris Declaration so strongly, and they'll mostly focus on China's method of infrastructure first and everything else afterwards. So I was wondering if you had thoughts on that.
I have some questions regarding the labor quality, because when we think about how Asian countries are trying to develop, and we try to beat the numbers, like we try to increase the number of enrollments, and we try to increase the number of people who graduate from high school and so on and so forth. But then if we actually really look at the quality of the labor that schools or universities produce, I am not sure, well, maybe they are actually getting better, but I'm not sure how, well, I would like to hear what you think. I would like to hear your opinions on this issue, on the high variation in labor quality in Asian countries, especially in Thailand.
Okay, I think take one more question and let Professor answer.
I'm master student from here and I came from Myanmar. I have some question is actually it's concern for our country. As our agent mentioned about the education level, our country educations and the other developed country in ASEAN members, and also India as the highest in the IT, and China also have so many students for the university level. So that gap will be more and more bigger, or the gap will be reduced the size. And if it is more harmful for our country, low developing country like Myanmar, I would like to know that questions.
Alright, so I'm going to give a good time for Professor Widnaraja to give some comments or answers.
Thank you very much. This is really rich stuff from you all and forces me to think a lot. The first is on the ASEAN being less represented in the growth dynamic of the future compared to China and India. Okay, so what I should have said earlier is that this study benefited from another study called ASEAN 2030, which had specific papers and research on the ASEAN economy, right? And it made assumptions about some of the countries that were there, and then this study just took the ASEAN stuff and put it in. Okay? And China and India were really what this study looked at. And I think that study took a less sanguine way of ASEAN, and I think it because it went to 2030, it assumed some of the stuff on AEC 2015 would get missed. And by definition, then it assumed that national adjustment was insufficient to give you that big gain to be the same level of China and India in terms of the changes that may occur. Particularly in India, which was just waking up, right, to some of these changes. And then there was an assumption, you know, from China that it would continue to grow at a fast pace, which we are now seeing an adjustment. This is the problem with economics, right? Things change so fast. So I think that explains the issue. And then in ASEAN, I think they're worried about the productivity, human capital, exactly the questions you all are raising, in the face of the sort of challenges that you will have with the rise of China and things like that, and more integration. So I think this adjustment issues for ASEAN were looming large, and also there was a concern about the institution. The ASEAN Secretariat was probably too small, ineffective in some ways, maybe that's what the study argued. And so these explain the gap, right? And don't forget, particularly in India, you know, you're coming with a population that's youthful, very hungry for, you know, some of that billion middle class, for all those wonderful things that you get if you're a middle class country like this. In Thailand, the living standard is way better than that of the average Indian. Right? The rich Thai lives better. And that sort of 1-point-something billion Indians want that. And my gosh, that's going to be a huge dynamic for change. Particularly if they have these 16 million bank accounts and more that world is promising. So big changes. So I think that was where the ASEAN. So the challenge is really for ASEAN and for Thailand to maintain this and to prove everyone wrong in 2030. So that's the issue of the growth rate. And you're probably right, if we excluded Singapore and Brunei, 8 countries probably make some sense, and so on. I think you're probably right, outliers make sense. Human capital, lots of questions from the model as well as the practical side. I think this particular study, when it was done, I think they just talked about, you know, quantities rather than the quality. You know, and clearly, if you add the quality in, you're going to get change in some of the numbers. I think, to be honest, I think more important will be the residual, the total factor productivity, and you break that up. I think will be much better. Because, you know, technological progress is something that was not that well understood in the study, and probably the gains of that coupled with technical labor will make a difference for the numbers. But again, very hard for this study to forecast what technology will be available in 2030, right? And the frontier is changing so fast. So, you know, within the realms of possibility, you have a set of ideas, but you're certainly right. Bringing the other couple of human capital questions, for the productivity of labor, yes, there are big variations, I think, across ASEAN countries in this. And I think if you put a labor productivity index, you know, hopefully Thailand is up there, hopefully the top country, but Vietnam must be close in some sectors. And the question is for the wage, the given wage, is Thailand competitive? That's the real question. No, but I mean, that's the serious question, right? And that will determine whether you can, in part, whether you can keep your low-end manufacturing. And please, that's a very frightening question if I were a Thai policymaker to worry about this. So I think, it's very hard to compete with Vietnam at that level. The workers work long shifts, they do 3 things, they get paid a much lower wage. If one Vietnamese doesn't come to work, there are 10 outside the factory wanting that job. My gosh, tough. So the only thing you can do is to educate the workers better, to incentivize them somehow, which involves some sort of profit-sharing schemes, and that requires corporate governance, which one hopes people are thinking about. It involves a lot of investment in training, in education, not necessarily at the university level, although it's terribly important. And one hopes companies will invest at the global standard of 1% of turnover on training. I suspect most Thai companies are not doing that. I could be very wrong, but I suspect. And I suspect the kind of training they're providing is not the technical training that workers need. So there are these sets of issues you've got to break up. And certainly for Myanmar, you need to do all of this. You need to get those companies that are going to come in, including from Thailand, that are going to train your people to do industrial work because your wages are still low, although rising very fast because of scarcities in demand. You're going to have to improve your education system and jump from what some people characterize as a 20th century world to a 21st century world, and get people educated in modern capitalism, basically. Business, science, math, government, all of those things. And you'll have to massively increase the supply of tertiary workers. And hopefully Thammasat should help you, and you will be a star in this. So all of this is going to be critical. So at all levels you've got to do this. Right? You've got to revolutionize your skill base. Without that you ain't got enough. Natural resources ain't enough, in my view. And I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
Sorry for interrupting. Could you just to summarize things?
Sure. Your last questions on the AIIB. ADB has an official position that I, as a card-carrying bank staff, have to say. ADB president said that he welcomes the AIIB because of the infrastructure gap in Asia, and that he wants to see the fine print, and the bank wants to see the fine print of what the AIIB will actually look like on paper before working out how ADB and World Bank and others can cooperate with such an institution. And so I think that's very clear. My private take on this is, we will be in a new architecture, and we've got to think of, competition versus cooperation as we go forward. And the last question, just to answer on the CMIM and the banking integration. Banking integration, I hope Peter will say something a little bit about. Peter's banking expert. I think personally it may be incomplete by 2020, both in terms of the regulatory side as well as the sector development. Certainly, it's a bank-dominated system in Asia. The capital market is much more early stage. One hopes that the capital market will become much more important and SME finance will be clearer, but Peter may have other views. On the CMIM, a very important thing after the Asian financial crisis, but hasn't been tested, partly because countries don't want to necessarily go to it, and they're worried particularly about the stigma associated with going to the IMF. And this country, more than any, knows that very well, but Korea does as well. But we've got to work out, so it's a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next paper we have Peter Morgan, senior consultant from research for ADB, to present the paper on the connecting South Asia and the Southeast Asia. So on the first paper we have a big picture on the transformations of connecting all the Asia's high growth, and the next paper will focus on Southeast Asia and how we develop, and then I'm going to apply the same rules, 12 minutes for presentations and then 5 minutes for comments. And a good thing for being chair and discussions at the same time, so I can keep all residual to my. I also have Professor Sichai next to me, and I'm going to force her to keep the time short, so we can finish the seminar before 5 o'clock. Okay, please.
Thanks very much. So this study is called Connecting South Asia and Southeast Asia. This is a joint flagship project of ADB and ADBI. Actually, the interim report of this study came out last year, which we presented at the ADB annual conference, and it's on our website. I'll just hand out these flyers here. The final report is in its final stages of preparation, and hopefully the manuscript will be finished in about a month from now, and then publication early next year. Now, the first point I make is that the title is Connecting South Asia and Southeast Asia. Of course, we know they're already connected, so it's really how to better connect South Asia and Southeast Asia, but that's not quite as catchy a title, so we have this stuff. But what the study is really about is to find ways to promote